The night was cold, and the wind cut through the broken metal walls of the abandoned shelter where she had been hiding for days. Her thin blanket was no match for the freezing air, and her small alien body shook without control. She had not slept for more than a few minutes, and many nights every sound outside made her heart race. Because out there in the darkness were the scavengers who would capture any weak creature for trade, or worse. She had been running from them for weeks, ever since her home colony was destroyed by raiders. She had no family, no friends, no place to call safe. Her feet were sore. Her stomach was empty, and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she could not stop. She could not risk being found. She curled up in the corner, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the shadows, but the cold crept deeper into her bones. Each passing moment, she remembered the warmth of her old home, the soft bed her mother made for her when she was little, the smell of cooked food in the air, and the feeling of safety. Those memories hurt now, because they felt like another life, a life she would never get back. She hugged her knees tighter, wishing for even one night of warmth, one night without fear. Then she heard footsteps, slow, careful footsteps crunching on the frost outside the shelter. She froze, her breathing shallow, her mind racing. Was it the scavengers? Had they found her again? Or was it another desperate wanderer like her? She pressed herself against the wall, listening. The steps stopped just outside the entrance. There was silence for a moment, and then a voice, a deep, calm voice that did not sound like any alien tongue. She knew it was human, the rare kind that most in her galaxy only heard about in stories. The voice called softly, telling her he meant no harm, that he had seen her from a distance and only wanted to help. Her heart pounded faster because she had heard tales of humans. Some said they were dangerous, unpredictable. Others said they were protectors, capable of great kindness. She did not know which to believe. She stayed silent, hoping he would leave, but then she felt the cold shift as the doorway darkened and a figure stepped inside. The man was tall, wearing a thick coat with frost gathered on the edges, his breath visible in the icy air. His eyes scanned the dim shelter and landed on her. He did not move closer. Instead, he crouched down at a distance to seem less threatening. His voice was gentle, asking if she was alone, if she was hurt, if she had anywhere to go. She wanted to shout at him to leave, but the cold in her body made too. Maid/only ruby kiss. Any maid/only ruby kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on. Maid/last ma key and leaves a wretch, long-lasting color. If she was alone, if she was alone, if she was alone, to see//lies/a lab, you had/a laugh. Maid/a laugh. May we need to go to Sila. Quote I'd size. We need slask. Her shiver so violently she could barely speak. He noticed this and slowly removed the heavy coat from his shoulders, laying it on the ground between them, telling her she could take it if she wanted. No one had offered her anything in so long that her mind could not trust it was real. She stared at the coat, then at him, searching for any sign of a trap, but his expression was calm, patient, like he could wait all night. Her fingers reached out, trembling, not just from the cold, but from the fear of what might happen. She pulled the coat closer, wrapping it round herself, instantly feeling the warmth seep into her frozen limbs. The man gave a faint smile and said it was warmer where he was staying, that he had food and a bed. She almost laughed because a warm bed sounded like a dream. Too far to believe, she asked why he would help her when she was not human, and he simply said no one should freeze alone in the dark. Something in his tone made her chest ache. It was not pity, it was something deeper. She hesitated, still unsure, but when a distant howl echoed through the night, her decision was made. She could not face another night out here. She nodded once, and he extended a hand, not rushing her, not pulling her, just waiting for her to choose. She took it, and his grip was firm, steady, guiding her out of the shelter, into the snowy path under the pale light of distant stars. As they walked, she glanced at him, wondering if this was a mistake, but for the first time in weeks, the fear in her heart was mixed with a fragile spark of hope. They reached a small cabin built from scavenged metal and wood smoke rose from a chimney, and the faint orange glow of firelight spilled from the window when he opened the door. The rush of warm air made her eyes sting. She stepped inside and saw a bed in the corner layered with thick blankets. It was the kind of bed she thought only existed in her memories. He told her to rest, that she was safe here. She stood frozen in place, afraid that if she touched it, the dream would vanish. He placed a bowl of hot food on the table and told her she could eat when ready. Then he added something she never expected. He said the bed was hers tonight. No one had ever offered her a warm bed since she lost her home. No one had looked at her without seeing a burden or a prize to trade. She felt tears burn her eyes as she sat down the fire, crackling the air warm and soft, and for the first time in so long, she thought maybe she could sleep without fear. Maybe? Just for tonight, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like an unfamiliar embrace, her body still shivering slightly as it adjusted to the sudden comfort. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes darting between the fire and the human, who now busied himself with stirring a pot near the stove. The scent of the food filled the small room and made her stomach twist in longing, yet she hesitated, unsure if taking anything more from him would tie her to a promise. She did not understand. He glanced at her and spoke softly, saying she should eat. While it was hot, his voice carried no demand, only the steady calm of someone who had decided to help with no expectation in return. Still, she did not move, her mind racing with memories of the times. Kindness had been bait before the smile that came before the betrayal, but here the firelight painted his face in warm gold, and she could not see the shadow of deceit in his eyes. He moved closer, placing the bowl on the small table beside her, and then stepped back as if to give her space. The steam curled upward, and she could not resist leaning forward to take the first spoonful. The heat of the food spread through her chest and into her cold limbs. Her hands trembled as she ate faster than she meant to, and when she paused, embarrassed at her own hunger, he simply gave a faint nod and returned to the stove as if nothing about her desperation was strange. She wondered why a human would live alone out here on the frozen edges of nowhere. His clothes and tools looked worn yet cared for, and the way he moved around the cabin showed this was not a temporary shelter, but a place he had built and kept for some time. When she finally set the empty bowl aside, she pulled the coat tighter around herself and asked in a low voice why he was here instead of somewhere warmer. He paused at the question as though deciding how much to say, then told her that he had once been part of a larger crew, traders and explorers, but they had been scattered after a failed mission. He chose not to return to the cities because out here he could live. Without orders, without lies, she listened quietly, hearing in his tone a weight she recognized. The weight of loss. She wanted to ask more, but the exhaustion in her bones dragged her toward the bed. He noticed and told her she should rest. The blankets were thick enough to keep out the cold of the night. She lay down, still wary, but the bed embraced her in a way she had not felt in years. Her muscles began to loosen, her breathing slowed, and the crackle of the fire became a lullaby. Yet even as her eyes closed, she kept one ear open for danger. Habit would not let her sleep deeply in a strange place. She drifted in and out of dreams, till a sound outside cut through the calm. It was a faint crunching in the snow, almost like the footsteps she had heard earlier, but slower, heavier. Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up. The human head already moved to the door, his hand resting on a weapon strapped to his side. He signaled her to stay where she was and stepped out into the night. The seconds felt like hours, the cold air leaking through the small cracks in the walls. She crept toward the window, peeking through the frost to see him standing in the snow, his body tense. A shadow moved at the edge of the tree line, too far to see clearly, but large enough to send fear racing through her veins. The shadow did not approach. It circled slowly, as if testing the distance before fading back into the darkness. He stood there a while longer before returning inside, closing the door firmly and checking the locks. He did not explain what it was, only told her it would be wise to leave in the morning and that whatever was watching them would not give up Izalitha. Thought of leaving so soon after finding warmth made her chest tighten. She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told her this was not about choice, it was about survival. Still, he promised that if she stayed close, he would keep her safe, and for reasons she could not name, she believed him. She lay back down, trying to force sleep to come, but her mind kept replaying the shape in the darkness, wondering if it had been following her all along and if bringing it here had put him in danger. The fire burned lower and the room grew darker, yet the steady sound of his movements as he checked the cabin made her feel less alone, and as her eyes finally closed, she realized that even if the warmth of this bed lasted only one night, it had given her something she thought was gone forever: a reason to hope. The pale light of dawn crept through the frost-covered window, painting faint patterns on the cabin floor. She woke to the sound of quiet movement and saw the human packing a small bag, his hands quick and precise as he gathered tools, food, and equipment. Few pieces of gear. Her mind was still hazy from the warmth of the bed and the rare gift of sleep, but his urgency was clear. He told her they needed to move before the sun fully rose, because whatever had been watching them in the night would be closer now. She sat up, feeling the weight of the coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and a part of her wanted to beg to stay in this place where the fire and bed had made her feel safe, but the memory of that shadow in the snow pushed her to stand. He handed her a smaller pack filled with food and a blanket, and told her to keep it close. Then, without another word, he opened the door, letting the cold rush in the morning air was sharp, biting at her cheeks as they stepped outside there. Boots crunching over the frozen ground, the snow sparkled under the early light. But the beauty did not erase the tension in her chest. She kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see movement yet. The forest stood still and silent. They walked quickly, following a narrow path that wound through broken rocks and twisted trees, his pace steady and purposeful, as if he knew every turn by heart. She tried to match his stride, though her legs ached from days of running before she met him. Hours passed with only the sound of their steps and the occasional call of a distant bird. She began to wonder where he was taking her, until they reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Below lay the remains of an old settlement, half buried in snow and shadow roofs, caved-in walls leaning at strange angles. He crouched low, motioning for her to do the same, and pointed toward a cluster of intact structures near the center. He explained in a whisper that they would rest there for the day before continuing further, but that they needed to check if it was empty. She followed him down the slope, her eyes scanning every corner, her heart beating faster with each step toward the silent ruins. Beside the first building, the air was cold and stale, but there was no sign of recent activity. Broken furniture lay scattered, and frost coated the walls. He motioned for her to wait near the doorway while he searched the other rooms. She stood there, gripping the strap of her pack, her ears straining for any sound. The silence stretched until she began to feel the weight of it pressing against her. But then he returned, giving a short nod. It was safe for now. They set up in a corner where the walls were still solid enough to block the wind, and he started a small, controlled fire. She sat across from him, the flicker of the flames casting moving shadows on the walls. After a while, she asked him if he thought the thing in the forest would follow them here. His gaze met hers, and for a moment he did not answer. Then he said it was not just one thing. There were more, and they were patient hunters. The kind that could track someone for days without being seen. The thought made her skin crawl. She wanted to know why they were after her, but the words stuck in her throat. He seemed to sense her hesitation and told her that whatever her story, she did not need to tell it yet, that survival came first and trust could come later. As the day wore on, they took turns resting while the other kept watch. She tried to sleep, but every creak of the building and gust of wind outside kept her eyes half open. When it was her turn to watch, she studied him as he rested, his face in the firelight looked tired but resolute, like someone who had carried heavy burdens for a long time. She wondered if he had saved others before, or if she was the first to cross his path since he chose this life away from the cities. Quiet was broken by a faint sound far off in the valley. It was low and drawn out like a call or signal. His eyes opened instantly, and he sat up, listening. The sound came again. Slightly closer, he put out the fire in one swift motion, plunging them into dim gray light, and motioned for her to stay low. They moved to the back of the building and peered through a crack in the wall down below. In the snow-covered street, three figures moved slowly between the ruins, their shapes blurred by the swirling wind, but their movements deliberate and searching. She recognized the way they turned their heads, the way their shoulders hunched forward. It was the same predatory stillness she had seen before. The human whispered that they would have to leave sooner than planned, and that the only way out was through the far side of the valley, which meant passing dangerously close to the hunters. She felt her stomach tighten, fear pressing at her throat, but when he looked at her, his expression was steady and unshaken, as if he had already decided that they would make it through. She nodded, gripping the strap of her pack tighter, the air between them heavy with unspoken understanding. They waited until the hunters vanished behind another building before slipping out into the open snow, the wind biting at their faces, their footsteps muffled by the thick drifts. Each turn between the ruins felt like stepping deeper into the jaws of something unseen. Yet every time she faltered, his presence pulled her forward, and though the cold gnawed at her and the fear pressed against her chest, there was one thought that kept her moving: she was not alone anymore. The wind howled through the narrow gaps between the broken walls as they moved deeper into the ruins, their breaths forming quick clouds in the freezing air. She kept her eyes fixed on the human's back, trusting his every step, even when her instincts screamed to turn back. The snow crunched softly under their boots, but every sound felt too loud. In the heavy silence, they reached the far side of the valley, where the buildings thinned and the open ground stretched out toward a jagged ridge. Beyond it, she could see the faint outline of dark forest, and for a fleeting moment she thought of the safety the shadows might offer. But the human slowed and raised his hand, signaling her to stop. They crouched low behind the collapsed shell of an old structure and peered across the open ground in the distance. The hunters emerged from behind a row of leaning walls, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes scanning the snow for any sign of disturbance. She could feel her pulse in her throat. Each step the hunters took seemed to draw the air tighter around her. The humans studied them with an intensity that made her wonder what he was planning. He leaned closer and whispered that they would have to cross in short bursts, using the scattered wreckage for cover. Moving too fast would draw attention, but moving too slow would give the hunters time to catch their scent. Her stomach twisted with dread, but she nodded, gripping her pack tighter. He moved first, slipping from one pile of debris to another with quick, controlled strides. She followed, trying to match his speed, her legs straining against the deep snow. After 3 moves, they pressed against the side of a fallen wall. Listening, the hunters had stopped their heads, turning in unison toward the open ground. The human's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for her to wait. He picked up a chunk of frozen metal from the snow and hurled it toward the opposite side of the valley. The clang echoed through the ruins, and the hunters shifted in that direction, their slow movements accelerating just enough to give them a chance. They ran, the cold air burning in their lungs, snow flying up around their legs. The ridge loomed closer, but the ground between them and safety stretched like an endless trap. Her breath came in ragged bursts, and her vision narrowed to the path ahead. When they finally scrambled up the slope, her legs felt like they might give way, but the human grabbed her arm, pulling her up until they reached the crest. He did not stop there, leading her down into the shelter of the forest, where the sound of the wind through the trees masked their movements. They walked deeper into the woods, the dim light filtering through the branches, turning the snow into shifting shades of gray. She felt a flicker of relief until a faint snap of a branch behind them froze her in place. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the shadows. The human had already drawn his weapon. His stance calm but ready, a shape moved between the trees larger than she expected. For a hunter, its outline barely visible in the swirling snow. The creature did not charge. Instead, it watched from a distance, the faint gleam of its eyes locking on hers. A shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The human lowered his weapon slightly and whispered that it was not alone they would keep moving but avoid direct confrontation. For now she wanted to ask what these creatures wanted, but part of her feared the answer. They pressed on through the forest, following a narrow trail that wound between twisted roots and half-buried stones. As the light faded into the pale hues of evening, they found a small hollow between two fallen trees where the snow had not gathered as heavily. The human began to clear the space for a small fire, but stopped after glancing at her and shaking his head. No fire tonight. He said the light would draw unwanted attention. They ate in silence, chewing on the dry rations he had packed. The taste was bland, but it kept the edge of hunger away. When they finished, he adjusted his coat and told her to sleep while he kept watch. She wanted to protest, but the exhaustion in her body overpowered the fear. She curled into the blanket. He had given her the sounds of the forest wrapping around her like a restless lullaby. Her mind drifted to the warmth of the bed in the cabin, and she wondered if she would ever feel that safe again. Her sleep was shallow, filled with half-formed dreams and sudden jolts awake each time she opened her eyes. She saw the human still there, sitting with his back against a tree, his gaze scanning the darkness like he could see threats she could not. In one of those brief moments of wakefulness, she thought she saw movement again. Far beyond him, a flicker of shadow among the trees, but before she could focus it was gone. She closed her eyes again, clinging to the one truth she still believed. As long as he was there, she had a chance to survive. The first light of morning filtered weakly through the dense forest, casting long, thin shadows that swayed in the wind. She woke to the sound of the human quietly packing their supplies, his movements steady and deliberate, as if every sound needed to be controlled. Her body ached from the cold, hard ground, but the blanket had held enough warmth to keep her from shivering through the night. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and noticed the way he kept glancing into the trees as if expecting something to emerge. When she asked if the hunters were still following, he gave a short nod and said they had not given up their trail, and that today would be harder than the day before. They set off quickly, moving along a narrow game trail that wound between towering trees, their footsteps muffled by the snow. She kept her head down, focusing on each step, but her thoughts were pulled toward the strange unspoken bond forming between them. He had risked himself to help her, yet she still knew nothing about him, except that his eyes never stopped searching for danger, and that he had a way of moving that made even the frozen wilderness feel navigable. The air was sharp and cold, but a tension thicker. Then the weather pressed around them. By midday, they reached a stream half frozen with patches of dark water. Moving slowly between jagged sheets of ice, the human crouched and studied the ground, pointing out faint tracks that cut across the bank. He explained that the hunters had passed this way not long ago, and that their speed meant they were closing the gap. Her chest tightened as she realized the creatures could be watching them even now. He led her across the ice, moving quickly, but with care, each step sending a soft crack through the frozen surface. Her breath caught more than once as she imagined falling into the black water, but they made it across without breaking through. On the far side, the forest grew darker, the trees thicker, their branches heavy with snow. The path narrowed, forcing them to move in single file. She followed closely, her eyes on his back, trying to match his pace, until a sudden sound split the silence. A low, guttural growl from somewhere ahead. He froze his hand, moving to the weapon at his side. Without looking back, he whispered for her to stay behind him. They advanced slowly, the growl growing louder until a shape stepped into view. It was one of the hunters, taller than she expected. Its pale skin blending into the snow, its elongated limbs shifting with unnatural grace. It tilted its head, watching them with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. The human did not raise his weapon immediately. Instead, he stood his ground, his posture calm but unyielding. The hunter took a step forward, Then another, its claws curling slowly. He spoke, then his voice low and firm, telling her to move back. Slowly, she hesitated, her fear rooting her in place, until his voice sharpened with urgency. She stepped back one pace, then another, until the trees closed between them, blocking her view of the creature. A sound followed, then the sharp report of a weapon, the noise echoing through the forest. Birds took flight above, and the growl cut short, replaced by heavy silence. When he reappeared, his breathing was heavy, but his eyes scanned the trees without pause. He said nothing of what happened, only urged her to keep moving. They did not stop until the trees began to thin and the ground started to slope upward toward rocky cliffs. The climb was steep, and the snow here was thinner, revealing patches of ice and stone. The wind whipped harder, carrying the scent of frost and something faintly metallic. When they reached the top, she could see far in every direction the endless stretch of white, broken only by jagged peaks and scattered forests. He told her they would camp here. The height would give them warning if anything approached. They found a shallow cave in the cliff face, its mouth partly hidden by an overhang of rock. The interior was cold, but shielded from the wind. He set down his pack and began arranging stones to block some of the entrance, leaving a narrow gap for them to watch through. She sat near the back, pulling the blanket over her shoulders and listening to the distant howl of wind echoing off the cliffs. The sound was eerie, but the knowledge that he was still at the entrance keeping watch allowed her to close her eyes for brief moments as the evening light faded to deep blue. She asked him if they could outrun the hunters. He did not answer immediately, his gaze still on the horizon. Finally he said they would not need to outrun them forever, only until they reached a place where the creatures would not follow. She wanted to ask where that was, but the firmness in his tone made her hold the question inside instead. She lay down, listening to the faint creak of the ice and the steady rhythm of his breathing. And though danger was still close, the thought that he had a plan, no matter how far it was, gave her a fragile thread of comfort to hold on to through the night. Morning came with a pale gray sky and a wind that seemed sharper than the day before. She woke to the sound of the human shifting the stones at the cave entrance, his eyes scanning the horizon where faint shapes moved far in the distance. The sight made her chest tighten, for she knew, without him saying, that the hunters had found their trail again. He handed her a piece of dried food and told her to eat quickly because they could not afford to wait. The cold bit at her fingers as she packed her blanket into the small bag and followed him out into the open air. The climb down the cliff was slow and treacherous, the rock slick with ice and the drop below long enough to make her knees weak. He went first, guiding her steps with quiet instructions and steady hands, catching her once when her foot slipped and her balance faltered. When they reached the bottom, the wind cut through the gap between the peaks, carrying with it the distant sound of movement that made the back of her neck prickle. They set off across a stretch of open ground where the snow crunched loudly under their boots, each step leaving clear tracks. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, half expecting to see the pale shapes of the hunters closing in. By midday, they reached a frozen river wide and still covered with a thin crust of snow. The human tested the surface with his weight before motioning her forward. The ice groaned softly beneath them as they crossed a vast expanse, feeling exposed under the open sky. Halfway across, a deep cracking sound split the air, and her heart lurched. She froze in place, but he waved her onward, his own movements quick and sure, until they reached the far bank, where the ground rose sharply into another stretch of forest. The shelter of the trees was a relief, though the shadows within seemed heavier than before. The path wound upward between thick trunks and low-hanging branches that brushed against their coats. The air was still here, muffling the outside world until only the sound of their breaths remained. She began to relax slightly until the silence broke. With a faint rustle behind them, the human stopped, one hand raised and his eyes narrowing as he listened. The rustle came again, this time followed by a low hiss like air escaping through sharp teeth. He turned to her and mouthed the word, "Run." Her Heart pounded as they sprinted through the snow, dodging between trees and leaping over fallen logs, the sound behind them growing louder. Forest seemed endless, her legs burning as she pushed to keep up with his long strides until he suddenly veered off the main path into a narrow gap between two massive boulders. The space beyond opened into a hidden hollow where a small frozen pool lay surrounded by jagged rock walls. He pulled her behind a ledge, and they crouched low their backs. Pressed to the stone, the noise of pursuit grew closer until the shadow of a hunter passed along the edge of the hollow, its head turning side to side as it searched for their scent. She held her breath, the cold biting her lungs, until the shadow moved on, and the sound of footsteps faded into the distance. They waited in silence for what felt like hours before he finally signaled it was safe to move. They climbed out of the hollow and continued through the forest until the trees thinned, again revealing a vast plain, stretching toward the horizon far in the distance. She could see the faint outline of structures rising from the snow towers and walls that caught the fading light. Like dull metal, he told her it was a place where the hunters would not follow, but they would need to reach it before nightfall, or the cold alone could kill them. They pushed on across the plain, the wind stronger now, whipping snow into their faces. The world reduced to the crunch of their steps and the ache in her muscles. The towers ahead seemed to grow no closer, even as the light dimmed and the sky deepened to a dark steel gray. When her legs threatened to give way, he slowed just enough for her to catch her breath before urging her forward again, his determination like an anchor pulling her through the exhaustion. By the time they reached the base of the first tower, night had nearly fallen. The air, heavy with the promise of snow, he led her through a narrow gate into the shadow of the walls, the wind dying instantly as the stone blocked its force. Inside, the space was eerily quiet, the snow undisturbed, except for a few faint marks that vanished into the dark corridors beyond. He told her they would rest here for the night, and that, by tomorrow, they could reach the heart of the structure where the hunters would not dare follow, though he did not say why. She settled against the wall, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold, yet somewhere inside, she felt the first stirrings of belief that this journey might not end in her capture or death. The human moved to the edge of the shadows, keeping watch, his figure still and unyielding against the dim glow of the snow beyond, and though she did not know what awaited them inside the towers, she knew she would keep walking as long as he led the way. The night inside the shadow of the towers was unlike any she had known. The walls blocked the wind, but the silence pressed down on them like a weight so heavy it felt alive. She sat curled in her blanket, watching the human as he remained near the narrow gate, his weapon resting across his knees. His eyes fixed on the open plain beyond. The faint glow of the snow outside was the only light, and in that pale reflection she could see the endless emptiness they had crossed earlier. She wanted to ask if the hunters were still out there, but the set of his jaw told her he already knew the answer, and that it was yes. She drifted into uneasy sleep, waking at the smallest noise each time, seeing him in the same place, unmoving like the cold stone itself. When dawn finally came, it brought no warmth, only a weak light that made the frost on the walls glimmer. He told her they would reach the heart of the structure today, and that once they were inside, they would be safe. His voice was steady, but carried an edge that made her wonder what exactly was waiting in there. They packed quickly, moving through the narrow corridors where their footsteps echoed off the stone. The air smelled old and dry, as if no living thing had passed this way in years. The deeper they went, the taller the walls became, the corridors widening into vast open chambers supported by black stone pillars. Frost clung to every surface, and their breath swirled in white clouds around them. She stayed close to him, her fingers brushing the strap of his pack every few steps. The silence here was heavier than the one outside, like the place itself was holding its breath. They passed through a high arch into a long hall where shafts of light poured in through narrow slits high in the walls, illuminating floating dust. Motsi stopped suddenly, lifting a hand for her to stay still from. Somewhere deep in the hall came a sound low and distant, like a hum that rose and fell in slow waves. She felt it more than heard it, the vibration traveling up through the stone. Into her feet, he whispered that they were close and that no matter what happened, she should not step away. From him, they moved again to hum, growing stronger with each step until they entered a chamber vast enough to hold an entire village in. It's hollow, the walls curved upward into darkness, and at the center stood a structure unlike anything she had seen, a ring of smooth black stone with strange symbols glowing faintly across its surface. The air inside the chamber felt warmer, the cold, unable to penetrate the strange circle around the structure. Human approached it slowly, placing a hand on the stone, and for a moment the symbols flared brighter, casting long shadows across the chamber. She felt a strange pull toward it. Like the warmth of the bed in the cabin magnified 100 times, he turned to her and said that this was the reason. The hunters would not follow here. The structure was older than either of their worlds, and it radiated something the creatures feared, something they could not touch. She asked what it was, and he only said it was a doorway before she could ask more. The sound of pursuit shattered the stillness. Echoing through the corridors behind them, the hunters had found a way in there. Pale shapes emerging from the dark archways, the human stepped between her and them. His weapon raised, his voice calm as he told her to get inside the ring. She hesitated, torn between running and staying by his side, but his eyes locked on hers with such quiet command that her feet moved on their own. The moment she crossed into the circle, a wave of warmth swept over her. The hunters slowed their steps, their faces twisting with something between anger and fear. Yet they would not cross the invisible boundary. The human backed toward her, his weapon never lowering until he stepped inside the circle beside her. The hunters circled just beyond the edge, their bodies, hence their eyes, never leaving them, but they did not advance. After a long moment they turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the sound of their retreating steps. He lowered his weapon, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since she had met him. She looked up at him, the question in her eyes unspoken. He told her that in this place they could rest, and that the journey was over for now. They set up camp within the warmth of the circle, the black stone beneath them, smooth and solid. She lay down, feeling the tension drain from her body for the first time in what felt like forever. The humans sat nearby, watching the glowing symbols as if they held answers she could not yet understand. Sleep came quickly this time, without the weight of fear, and in her dreams she saw the bed in the cabin, the firelight on the walls, and his voice telling her she was safe. When she woke the next morning, he was still there, his presence steady and certain, and she knew that whatever lay beyond this place, they would face it together.